Welcome back to Dark Horror Stories. In today's episode, I'm sharing 10 deeply unsettling stories from the rural corners of America, forgotten valleys, inherited land, and trails that go places you were never meant to follow. These are accounts from people who found something waiting for them in the dark between the trees. Get comfortable, turn the lights down if you're brave enough, and let me know where you're watching from in the comments. Don't forget to like and subscribe so you never miss a story. Story 1. There's a county road in the hill country of West Virginia that locals call Binder's Stretch, not because of any official name, but because the trees on both sides grow so close together that at dusk, they seem to bind up the light before it can reach the road. I grew up about 12 miles from there, in a house my father built himself on a patch of land that had been in the family since before the state was a state. My grandmother used to say the hollow behind that county road had a long memory. I was maybe 9 or 10 when she said that, sitting at the kitchen table eating cornbread and soup beans, and I didn't think much of it. She said a lot of things. She had a habit of making the ordinary feel heavy. I was 31 when I drove back out there for the first time in years. My father had passed the previous spring, and he'd left me the property, not the house itself, which had been sold when he moved to the assisted living facility, but a strip of woodland behind the old fence line. About 40 acres, mostly second-growth hardwood with a creek running through the lower third. I'd been putting off going out there because it meant dealing with the paperwork, and also because the last time I'd been in that hollow I was 17 and came back without explaining to anyone why I'd torn my jacket clear off my shoulders running through the trees. I told myself that was old stuff. I was an adult. I drove out on a Thursday. I think it was Thursday, though it might have been Wednesday. I'd taken a few days off work and they'd started to blend together. I packed light, a backpack with some water, a folding saw in case I needed to mark a boundary tree, my cell phone mostly for photos, and a thermos of coffee that tasted burnt from the moment I poured it. I remember noticing the burnt taste and dumping half of it before I even left the truck. The access point was a gap in a rusted gate off the county road. Someone had tied a piece of orange plastic flagging to it at some point, and it had faded to a pale pinkish nothing. Beyond the gate, an old 2-track ran through goldenrod and sumac before disappearing into the tree line. I stood there for a minute, zipping and unzipping the front pocket of my jacket for no reason. Just something to do with my hands. The walk-in was fine, normal, red-winged blackbirds, a lot of them moving through the brush on my left. The 2-track went soft under my boots where a low spot held rain. I found a rusted coffee can someone had wedged into a fork of a tulip poplar. No idea how long it had been there, probably decades. The wood smelled like cold mud and something faintly sweet I couldn't place. Not bad, just sweet in a way I couldn't attach to anything. About a quarter mile in, I found what I'd come to find. The line of old fence posts my grandfather had driven into the ground along the property boundary. Most had fallen. A couple still stood, leaning like old men. I spent maybe 20 minutes walking the line, making notes on my phone, taking pictures for the surveyor. Ordinary work. The kind of thing you do because you have to and think about as little as possible. That's when I noticed the quiet. I want to be careful here because the woods are always quiet in a way city people find unsettling and country people don't usually register. But this was different, specific. The blackbirds had stopped. The wind had stopped. The creek, which I'd been hearing as a low, constant murmur since I crossed the ridge, had gone silent too, or I'd moved far enough from it that I'd lost it. The silence had a texture. That's the only way I can explain it. Like the air was holding something in. I told myself it was just a weather change. Clouds moving in, animals bedding down before a front. I'd grown up in these woods. I knew how the atmosphere could shift. I started back toward the truck. I found the first one about 10 feet off the two-track, a small cage, maybe 18 inches across, woven from what looked like stripped green branches twisted together into a rough sphere. Inside it were 3 bird skulls, a piece of red fabric, and something dark and matted I chose not to look at too closely. I stood there for a moment, turning it over in my mind. Kids, I thought, some kind of ritual nonsense teenagers got into. I'd done stranger things at that age. I left it and kept walking. The second one was hanging from a low branch overhead, spinning very slowly on a thin cord, same woven structure but larger and packed so densely with dark material that I couldn't see through it. It turned as I watched, even though there was no wind. I watched it turn a full rotation, then looked away. I started moving faster. There were more of them. 4, then 6, then what felt like dozens, though I might be misremembering. I might have been counting the same ones twice as the two-track curved. They were strung between branches, propped against roots, half buried in leaf litter with just the top arching above the surface. All of them turning or seemed to be even in dead still air. Some had been there a long time, the branches bleached and dry, the contents reduced to compressed dark shapes. Some looked fresh. The green branches still held their color. I started jogging. I'm not proud of it, but I did. I heard it before I saw it. A sound that started as a low rhythmic percussion, like someone drumming fingers on a hollow log, slow and deliberate. It came from my left, deeper in the trees, and it didn't stop when I stopped to listen. It kept its rhythm, even, patient. I turned and looked. About 40 feet into the trees, just beyond the range where my eyes could pick out detail with confidence, something was crouching beside a downed trunk. It was large, larger than I wanted to accept, folded over itself in a way that made it hard to parse the shape. Its back was to me. Whatever it was doing, it was occupied. Both arms were moving, and the drumming sound was coming from it. From those rhythmic movements, though I could not understand the mechanics of the sound from what I was seeing. Then it turned its head, not its body, just its head, rotating on the neck in a slow, deliberate arc until it faced me directly over its own shoulder. The face was pale and flat and so still it didn't look like a face at all. It looked like the place where a face should be, scraped smooth. No expression, no movement. Just that slow turn completed, and then it held. I ran. I didn't make a decision to run. I was simply running, and the two-track was under my feet, and the gate was ahead of me, and I went through it and across the gravel shoulder and into my truck, and I sat there with the doors locked for what my phone later told me was 22 minutes before I could make my hands work well enough to start the engine. I drove to my cousin's house 40 minutes away and didn't explain anything. I said I'd gotten turned around. She gave me a glass of water and didn't push it. 3 days later, when I finally went back to my truck where I'd parked it at my cousin's, I found something on the driver's side window, pressed flat against the glass from outside. A single woven cage, small enough to fit in my palm, still green. Inside, it was a tuft of dark hair that matched mine exactly. I threw it into a ditch on the highway and drove 6 hours home without stopping. I sold the property 8 months later to a timber company that I suspect will never actually log it. The surveyor I hired came back without completing the job and refunded my deposit without explanation. He didn't return my calls after that. I still don't know what those cages meant. I started thinking once that maybe I was starting to understand the pattern, and then I made myself stop. Some things don't benefit from being understood. Story 2. The summer I turned 24, my older brother Declan and I drove out to a piece of property our uncle had left us in the hill country of northern Arkansas. Our uncle, his name was Wesley, and he was my mother's younger brother, had died in February of that year quietly, in the kind of way that surprised everyone because nobody had known he was sick. He'd lived alone on about 60 acres outside a small town called Pelham's Creek for the last 15 years of his life. Grew a garden, kept bees, talked to his neighbors maybe twice a year. I'd visited him once when I was 12, and what I remembered was that he made good cornbread and kept every curtain in the house drawn even on bright days. Declan drove. I navigated, which mostly meant watching out the window at the landscape getting emptier and emptier. We crossed into the county just after noon on a Saturday. The gas station where we stopped had a hand-painted sign in the window that said fishing licenses, and a bell over the door that rang twice when we entered, and once when we left, which bothered me in a small, persistent way I couldn't explain. Declan bought a bag of peanuts and a root beer, and I bought a water I didn't end up drinking. The woman behind the counter asked where we were headed. When Declan told her the road, she nodded and looked back down at her magazine without saying anything else. I thought about that nod for the next 4 miles. Wesley's driveway was marked by 2 cedar posts with a rusted chain between them. No lock on the chain, just draped there. We unclipped it, drove in, clipped it back. Old habit in farm country, Declan said, though neither of us had grown up on a farm. The driveway was 200 yards of gravel and grass, tunneled by overhanging oaks that blocked the sky almost completely. At the end of it was the house. A low white clapboard with a tin roof greened over with algae, a covered porch, a detached garage with the door standing open. Everything neat. Wesley had been a neat man. Inside, the house smelled like cedar and something underneath it, mineral, slightly sharp like an old well. The refrigerator had been emptied and cleaned. The beds were made. On the kitchen counter, there was a stack of notebooks, which turned out to be Wesley's beekeeping records, hive weights, inspection notes, honey yields going back 11 years, written in handwriting so small I had to hold the pages close to read them. I don't know why I read them. I stood in his kitchen for maybe 10 minutes just reading about his bees, which had all died the previous winter, or so the last entry said. The last entry also said, in the same precise handwriting as everything else, "The markers have moved again. Putting the chain up tomorrow." I didn't mention that to Declan. We spent the first day walking the property, trying to figure out what we had. The house itself was in good shape. The garage held a riding mower, some hand tools, a chest freezer full of vacuum-sealed venison that Declan said we should deal with. Behind the garage, a path led through tall grass to Wesley's beehives, 8 of them, all standing open and empty, the frames inside stripped bare. Past the hives, the property turned to woods, mixed oak and hickory on a slope that ran down to a narrow creek, then up again to a back ridge that marked the property line. It was on that back ridge that we found the first marker. I want to be precise about what I mean when I say marker, because the word doesn't fully capture it. It was a post, a rough-cut wooden post, maybe 6 feet tall, driven into the ground at the crest of the ridge. To it were attached, at various heights, a series of tied bundles. Dried herbs, maybe, dark cord, small bleached bones I thought might be bird bones. The whole thing had a deliberate, careful quality, like someone had spent real time on it. Declan said it was probably old. Boundary markers, folk tradition, he said. He reached out to touch one of the bundles and I grabbed his arm without thinking. We left it and came back to the house. That night, and I should mention it was a warm night, windows open, whippoorwills going in the trees, I woke up at what my phone said was 3:17 in the morning. I'd been deeply asleep, and then I was completely awake, the way you get when something pulls you up rather than when you drift up naturally. I lay still, listened. From the direction of the back ridge very faintly came a sound. It took me a moment to identify it, footsteps moving slowly and evenly through dry leaves, not the erratic movement of an animal, measured, deliberate, moving along the ridge in one direction, then pausing, then moving back, like something pacing. I told myself it was a deer. I told myself it was raccoons, which can sound remarkably human in the dark. I pulled the sheet up and stared at the ceiling and listened to those footsteps pace and stop and pace for what felt like a long time. Then they stopped and something worse happened. Silence. And then from directly beneath my window, maybe 10 feet from the house, a sound I have spent 2 years trying to find a category for. It wasn't words. It wasn't an animal sound I knew. It was low and rhythmic and wet, almost like someone working their tongue against the backs of their teeth, and it continued for 11 or 12 seconds, I counted, and then it stopped. I did not look out the window. I made a very conscious decision not to look out the window. In the morning, I checked the ground beneath my window. The grass was flattened in a rough oval, maybe 4 feet across, as though something large had stood or crouched there. The soil at the center of the oval was disturbed, scratched up, turned over, and arranged in the scratched area with a precision that made me feel deeply unwell. Were 17 small stones laid out in a pattern that I can only describe as a broken ring, one stone removed from where it should have been and set apart from the others by about 2 inches. I woke Declan and showed him. He looked at it for a while. He said we should leave. We had only been there 1 night. We went back to the house and I started pulling Wesley's notebooks apart, looking for anything. On the 3rd notebook from the bottom of the stack, wedged between 2 pages, was a single index card in Wesley's small handwriting. It said, "It counts what you leave out. Don't count back." That was all. I have no idea what it meant. Declan thinks it means don't establish a pattern, don't let it learn your behavior, but that's just Declan trying to find logic in something that doesn't have any. We sold the property to a man from Memphis who said he wanted to hunt it. I tried twice to mention the marker on the ridge. Both times I found I couldn't put the words in the right order to make them sound like something worth saying. He signed the papers. I drove home. The 17 stones are the thing that stays with me, not the sounds, not the flattened grass. The fact that 1 stone was missing from the ring, left out, set apart, like something was answering a question I hadn't known I'd asked. Story 3. I took the job in October because I needed the money, which is how most bad decisions begin and also how most honest stories begin, so there it is. The job was simple on paper. Spend 3 weeks at a remote fire lookout tower in the National Forest of northern Idaho, complete some deferred maintenance, repaint the exterior gallery, submit a condition report. The tower had been unstaffed for going on 6 years, and the Forest Service wanted eyes on it before they decided whether to restore the program or decommission the structure entirely. I had a background in facilities maintenance, a tolerance for solitude that most people found unsettling in a social context, and enough savings to get me through winter only if I took every available contract. So I said yes. The drive-in was 2 hours on a paved highway, and then 40 minutes on a gravel forest road, and then about 20 minutes on a 2-track that made me worried for my axles. I got there in the early afternoon of a Monday in the 2nd week of October, and the sky was doing that thing it does in the mountains that late in the year where the light is already tired and orange even at 3 in the afternoon. The tower sat on a granite knob above the tree line, a standard 60-foot structure, cab at the top, a caretaker's storage shed at the base, everything in the weathered green paint that Forest Service uses for things they want you to forget are man-made. I sat in my truck for a minute before getting out, eating a granola bar that was stale and tasting faintly of the plastic wrapper. I always eat when I arrive somewhere new, something to do. The access hatch to the tower interior was locked with a padlock I had the key for. The interior staircase was solid. I checked each step before committing my weight out of habit. The cab itself was intact. A rotating bed that folded down from the wall, a small wood stove, the Osborne fire finder still mounted to the central table though its map was 20 years out of date, and a logbook in a metal box bolted to the wall. I opened the logbook. The last entry was from 6 years ago, written by the previous occupant, a woman named Sorensen, going by the signature, and it said only, "Wind E at 15. Smoke report false, source unknown, not coming back." I took note of that and then decided not to take note of it, if that makes sense. People left jobs for all kinds of reasons. She'd probably just found something better. The first week was fine, cold at night down into the 20s, but the stove handled it and I had good gear. I worked through the maintenance list methodically. The painting went slowly because the temperature kept dropping below the threshold for proper adhesion, but I got the north and east faces done. I developed routines: coffee at first light, exterior check, maintenance work until noon, lunch, afternoon radio check with the district office 30 miles away, an hour of reading before the light failed, then supper and the stove and sleep. The isolation didn't bother me. I'd taken jobs like this before. What bothered me was the birds, or rather the absence of them. For the first 4 days, there was a reasonable amount of wildlife activity visible from the cab: nuthatches, Clark's nutcrackers, occasional ravens. On the 5th morning, nothing. I made note of it in my daily log as an observation, nothing more. The silence was complete enough that I could hear the wind moving through the individual pine needles on the slope below the knob, which is a sound I'd never consciously heard before and haven't heard since. Fine-grained, constant. That evening, during my radio check, I mentioned it to the dispatcher, a man named Orville who'd worked the district for decades and whose voice had the particular flat quality of someone who'd given up being surprised by anything. He paused when I described it. Then he said to make sure my exterior lights were working and to do a full perimeter check of the base shed before dark. I asked him why. He said it was just standard protocol for that station. I asked if there were bears in the area. He said there were always bears in that area. He signed off. There was something in the specificity of that instruction before dark that I sat with for a while. I did the perimeter check. I found nothing unusual. The base shed was secure. I went up the tower and bolted the access hatch from inside, which I had not been doing previously. That night I woke up, I'd guess around 2 in the morning, but I didn't check, to a sound on the exterior stairs. Footsteps. Clear and deliberate, ascending. The staircase on these towers is open steel grating and footsteps on it have a distinctive ringing quality. These were slow, maybe 4 seconds between each step. I lay in the folding bed for a while, running through the list. Bear, elk, maybe a large bird landing on the railing and walking, some acoustic effect of the wind. The footsteps continued. 17 steps to the cab platform. I counted them. At the 17th step, they stopped. I waited. Nothing moved. No sound outside the wind. Then there was a sound at the trapdoor, not knocking, not exactly. More like something exploring the edges of it, a soft, irregular pressure moving around the frame of the hatch, testing it without urgency, taking its time. I picked up my flashlight and the hatchet I kept beside the stove for splitting kindling. I did not open the hatch. I sat in the dark and listened to that soft searching pressure move around the perimeter of the door for what my racing mind turned into forever and my watch later told me was about 4 minutes. Then it stopped. Footsteps again, descending, slow, even. In the morning, I opened the hatch and looked at the exterior platform. Pressed into the frost that had formed on the steel grating were prints I spent a long time staring at. They began at the top of the stairs and ended at the hatch, and they were large, longer than my size 11 boot by several inches. But what made me step back from them was not the size. It was that they were wrong in a structural way. The weight distribution was wrong, the arch wrong, the toe arrangement wrong. They looked like someone had made a rough sketch of a human footprint from a description without ever having seen one. I radioed the district office. Orville answered. When I described the prints, there was a pause long enough that I thought I'd lost the signal. Then he said, in the same flat voice, "How many?" 11, I said, having counted. 11 going up, 11 going down. Another pause. "Pack your overnight bag," he said. "Leave the rest. I'm sending someone up the road." "What is it?" I asked. "We'll talk when you're down," he said. We never talked. The man he sent, a younger ranger named farmhouses, drove me out in silence and dropped me at my truck at the Forest Road junction. When I tried to ask questions, he said he wasn't the right person to answer them. He waited until I started driving before he turned around and headed back toward the tower. I submitted my partial condition report. I billed for the 11 days I'd worked. The payment came through without any correspondence. A month later, I checked the district's public management documents and found that the tower had been officially decommissioned. I still have photos of those prints on my phone. I've shown them to 3 people, including a wildlife biologist who studies large carnivores in the Pacific Northwest. She looked at the photos for a long time and then said that she didn't have a framework for what she was seeing and asked me to send them to her. I sent them. She never acknowledged receiving them. Story 4. My grandmother's family came to eastern Tennessee in the early 1800s, or so the story went, and they settled on a crook of land above a creek in a hollow nobody had bothered to name. By the time my grandmother was born, the land had names: the lower field, the rock garden, the waiting trees. And each name meant something specific to her family in a way they didn't explain to outsiders. I grew up hearing about the hollow from her, late at night sometimes, in that half-telling way older people have where they're not quite sure you're old enough for the full story. She died when I was 19 and left the hollow to my mother, who left it to me along with a coffee can full of cash and a note that said, "The markers are yours to tend or yours to leave. Choose one." I did not choose. I let the property sit for 3 years while I lived in Knoxville and worked at a restaurant, and told myself I'd deal with it eventually. Eventually came when my friend Petra Soares, she'd grown up in South Florida, had never spent a night in genuine backcountry, and had a habit of treating anything she didn't understand as a dare, found out I owned land in the mountains and wouldn't leave me alone about going until I agreed. We drove down on a Friday afternoon. I hadn't been back since my grandmother's funeral, which we'd held at a church in town, not at the hollow. My mother had been specific about that. The access road off the highway was easy to miss, an unmarked gap in the tree line where a gravel track ran back through the hemlocks. I almost missed it, and Petra said that one from the passenger seat before I spotted it, which I didn't think much about at the time. The hollow itself was smaller than I remembered, the way places always are when you're an adult. The house was gone, had been gone for years. Petra's family took it down rather than let it fall, and all that remained was the stone foundation, filled with decades of leaf fall and wild blackberry canes, and beyond it a clearing that still held the shape of someone's intention. Someone had kept it clear once. The trees had taken back part of it, but not all, like they were respecting a boundary. We set up camp in the clearing, which felt wrong to me in a way I didn't say out loud. Petra was enthusiastic about the location, the creek, the Hemlock Cathedral, the light coming through in long gold shafts the way it does in the mountains in late afternoon. I put up the tent and made a fire and ate without tasting my food. The first thing I noticed was the stumps. I'd seen them before years ago, but I'd been a teenager then and not paying attention. They were scattered through the trees behind the clearing, maybe a dozen of them, old-growth stumps going back who knew how long, and each one had something carved into it, not graffiti, older than that. The carvings were the same on every stump I looked at, a rough oval at the top of the carving, and below it a series of lines radiating outward, like the symbol you might make for the sun if you were a child drawing the sun for the first time and didn't have a precise concept of it yet. Petra found them interesting. She photographed them. I told her to stop but couldn't explain why in a way that didn't sound paranoid, so I let it go. After dark, the hollow changed. I don't know how else to put it. During the day it had been a place, pleasant even, quiet, the kind of quiet that restores you. After dark it became a container. The sounds of the creek and the insects and the small movements in the leaves were still there, but they seemed to recede, as though moving away to leave room for something else. We turned in around 10. Petra fell asleep quickly. I lay with my eyes open for a long time listening. At some point, I want to say around midnight, but time had gone unreliable on me, I became aware of breathing outside the tent. Slow, deep breathing, almost meditative in its steadiness. I told myself it was Petra, but Petra was inside the tent, asleep beside me, and her breathing was much quieter than this. I told myself it was an animal. I'd heard that deer sometimes approach camp when they smell food, though what I was hearing didn't match any deer sound I knew. I reached over and shook Petra awake. She came up confused and then heard it too, because I saw her face change in the low green light of the tent fabric. We lay side by side, not speaking, not moving, and listened to that deep, even breathing move slowly around the perimeter of the tent. It made a full circuit, then a second. On the third circuit it stopped. I heard the sound of something sitting down heavily in the leaf litter directly beside the tent. A single solid sound like a large weight settling, and then nothing. No breathing, no movement. Just the presence of something very large, very close, resting on the other side of 4 millimeters of ripstop nylon. I put my hand over Petra's mouth before she could speak. She nodded that she understood. We lay like that, I genuinely don't know how long. My phone said 3 hours had passed when I checked it later, which means either my perception was completely collapsed or I fell asleep at some point and don't remember it, until gray light began to filter through the tent fabric. When I unzipped the tent and looked out, the clearing was empty, but the leaves directly beside the tent, a space roughly 6 feet long and 4 feet wide, had been pressed flat, the impressions too large and too specific to be wind or fallen branches. And there were marks on the nearest hemlock trunk, not scratches, something more deliberate than scratches. 3 shapes carved into the bark at chest height, each one an oval with radiating lines, same as the stumps, done in the night while we slept. We packed in 20 minutes and left without eating. I went back once alone in daylight 6 months later to tend the markers. My grandmother's note said choose one, tend them or leave them. I had left them long enough. I cleared the overgrowth, reset the ones that had fallen, did whatever instinct told me needed doing without knowing why. I don't know if it was the right choice. Nothing happened that day. But when I got home and was unloading my truck, I found a small hemlock branch in my bag, one I had not put there. It had been stripped of all its needles except for 3 at the very tip. Those 3 needles were tied together with a piece of dark thread. I didn't throw it away. I don't know what that says about me. Story 5. You'd think that living in the Flint Hills of Kansas your whole life would make you immune to the way the landscape can turn on you. It's not like the mountains. There are no forests to swallow you, no cliff faces, no rivers that flood without warning. It's just grass. Miles and miles of tall grass, prairie rolling in every direction until the sky closes down on it and you're the only thing vertical for as far as you can see. I grew up thinking that openness was safety. I grew up wrong. My name doesn't matter, but I was 29 the summer the survey job took me out to the far eastern section of the Tallgrass Preserve. A section that hadn't been formally surveyed in decades because nobody went out there. The seasonal crew had been promised state funding that fell through, so it was just me and a woman named Celia Brandvik who'd done this kind of work in Montana and had the kind of efficiency that made you feel slow by comparison, and an intern named Dwayne who was 22 and talked too much in the mornings and too little by afternoon. We were out there 3 days. The first 2 were textbook. Hike in, run transects, collect data, hike out to the truck before dark. Long days, flat land, the wind constant enough that you stopped noticing it, which I've always found slightly unnerving. When you stop noticing a constant force, you've given something up without knowing it. On the 3rd day, we found the depression. It wasn't on the topo map, which was outdated but should have caught anything significant. It was a circular low area, maybe 70 feet across, where the tall grass gave way to shorter vegetation and the ground went soft underfoot. Not a pond, no standing water. Not a buffalo wallow, which I'd seen plenty of because the proportions were wrong. Just a perfect circle of slightly different earth, the grass inside it a shade darker and denser than the grass outside it. Celia stopped at the edge of it and didn't step in. I noticed that and filed it away without comment. Dwayne walked around the perimeter photographing it on his phone. I knelt at the edge and pressed my hand into the soil, which was warmer than the surrounding ground, noticeably warmer, enough to feel strange, and felt a vibration so slight and low I wasn't sure for a moment whether I was feeling it or imagining it. I stood up and suggested we record the location and move on. Celia agreed immediately. Dwayne wanted to know what it was. Neither of us had an answer. We were 3 hours into our hike back to the truck when Dwayne said he needed to stop. He'd left his data recorder at the transect point we'd visited closest to the depression. His handwriting was terrible and the recorder had all our counts from the afternoon. I know, we should have all 3 gone back, but Celia and I were loaded with equipment and Dwayne was fast and the distance wasn't far and there was still light. He said he'd be 20 minutes, 30 at most. He jogged off back through the grass. He came back in 25 minutes, slightly out of breath, recorder in hand, data intact. Fine. He was quiet the rest of the way to the truck. Quieter than his afternoon quiet, which was already noticeable. I figured he was tired. That night at the motel in town, I went to Dwayne's room to go over the data, and he opened the door looking like he hadn't slept even though we'd only been back a few hours. I asked if he was okay. He said he was. Then he said, without preamble or context, there was someone standing in the depression when I went back. I waited, standing in the middle of it, he said. Just standing there, facing east. I called out. I thought maybe it was a hiker, someone from the state park, and it turned around. He stopped. I asked what it looked like. He sat down on the edge of the bed. He said its face was right, like totally normal face, but it was standing with its feet, both feet facing backward. The heels were at the front. The toes were pointing behind it. And it had turned its upper body around to look at me, but the legs hadn't moved. He picked up his data recorder from the nightstand and held it out to me. The screen was cracked in a clean horizontal line, though he said he hadn't dropped it or hit it against anything. The morning's data was fine. Everything recorded after the point when he'd gone back to retrieve it, about 45 minutes of notes, was overwritten with a single repeated number, 17. Hundreds of entries, all 17 in every data field. We filed a combined incident report with the State Park Service and got a response 2 weeks later from an administrator who thanked us for our observation and noted that the depression had been flagged for further review. We never heard anything more. Celia texted me 6 months later and said she'd heard the survey program for that section had been suspended indefinitely. She didn't say anything else and I didn't push it. Dwayne quit, went to work for an architecture firm in Denver. I ran into him once at a conference the following year and he shook my hand and talked about normal things, and at the end of the conversation said, quietly and with no transition, "I still dream about the feet." Then he went back to his table and I didn't see him again after that. Story 6. The old Harwick property sat at the end of a dirt road in the swampy lowland country of southern Georgia, about 20 miles from any town large enough to have a stoplight. I had no business being there except that I'd bought it sight partially unseen at an estate auction for less money than I should have been comfortable paying, which in retrospect was information I failed to process correctly. I was 35, recently divorced, recently transferred to a job in the region, and in possession of the particular kind of bad judgment that comes from wanting to feel grounded somewhere when you have no idea where you belong anymore. The house had been in the Harwick family for 4 generations, and the last of the Harwicks, a woman in her 90s named Dorothea, had spent the last decade of her life refusing to leave even as the structure deteriorated around her. She died in a room upstairs. The estate had sold everything. I knew all this from the auction materials. What the auction materials did not tell me was why the house had been on the market for 3 years before I bought it, or why the property had been relisted twice by different real estate agencies, or why a local contractor named Pell, who I hired to walk through the structure with me on my first visit, spent most of our walkthrough standing in doorways rather than entering rooms fully. Pell was a large man with a gray beard and the kind of accent that suggested he'd never lived more than 30 miles from where he was born. He told me the house was structurally sound, which it mostly was. He told me the roof had 5 to 8 years left, which seemed optimistic. When I asked him about the back rooms, there were 2 rooms off the kitchen that someone had nailed shut from the outside, the planks going across the door frames on the exterior side. He said he'd rather I hired someone else to deal with those. I asked why. He said he'd been in one of those rooms once years back, doing a job for Dorothea. He said there was something in the wall, something that moved when he got close to it, a slow lateral movement back and forth, like something pacing in a very small space. The wall was solid on his inspection, no cavities, no visible gaps. He told Dorothea. She said, "Yes, that's right." And she'd watched him with an expression he described as relieved, like she'd been waiting for someone else to acknowledge it. I paid Pell for his time and didn't hire him back. I told myself he was superstitious. I told myself old houses made sounds and old men in small towns made stories. I unpacked my boxes and moved in and did not open the back rooms. For 2 weeks, I lived in the part of the house that didn't include those rooms and told myself that was fine. The house had plenty of space. The back rooms weren't necessary. There was a wet, particular smell that came from that direction, sometimes mineral and dark, like standing creek water, but I burned candles and kept the kitchen windows open. On a Thursday evening in early March, the smell was worse than it had been. I stood in the kitchen and looked at the boards across those doors and thought about what Pell had said. The pacing thing, the slow lateral movement. I put my hand flat on the nearest planked door. The movement started immediately, slow, back and forth, maybe 2 feet of travel each way, something brushing the interior surface of the door with each pass. Unhurried, rhythmic, like a pendulum, like something that had been doing this for a very long time and was very tired of it. I stepped back. I did not remove my hand fast. I moved it away slowly, deliberately, the way you do when you don't want something to know you've stopped making contact. That night I woke to the sound of dripping. Slow, uneven dripping from the direction of the kitchen. I found water on the kitchen floor, not a lot, but a thin spreading puddle coming from under the gap at the bottom of one of the nailed doors. The water was dark, not sewage, no smell like that, just very dark, almost black, like water from the bottom of a deep well. It had spread maybe 18 inches across the kitchen floor. I did not mop it up that night. I sat at the kitchen table with every light on until morning. And I want to be honest about the fact that I was frightened in a way I hadn't felt since childhood. The specific kind of frightened that makes you feel very small and very certain that the house you are in is not neutral, that it has been organized around something that has nothing to do with you. In the morning, the water had dried or been reabsorbed. I couldn't tell which. I hired a different contractor to remove the planks from the doors, and told him to do it while I was in town. He called me on my cell phone while I was at the hardware store. He said he'd removed the planks. He said the rooms were empty. He said I should come look at the walls. I drove back and I looked. Every wall in both rooms, floor to ceiling, all 4 sides had been marked. Not scratched. Marked deliberately with something dark, the same mark repeated hundreds of times in every direction. It was the outline of a hand, always the same hand, slightly too large, the fingers slightly too long, the thumb at an angle that wasn't quite human. Thousands of them, going back decades from the varying degrees of fade, all of them faced inward. All of them were palm out, as though pushing against the interior surface, as though something had spent a very long time pressing outward from inside the walls. I rented a storage unit for my boxes, put the house back on the market, and drove north. I lost money on the sale. I would lose more to be free of it. What I can't lose is the image of those hands, thousands of them, patient, pressing outward, waiting for the wall to finally give. It has yet, as far as I know, but I left. Story 7. Growing up in the deep pine country of East Texas, you learn early that not all water sounds the same. Moving water, still water, water in a pipe versus water in a culvert versus water in a place it has no right to be, they each have different voices. My grandfather taught me that. He was a water dowser, which is the kind of thing that gets you laughed at in some circles and taken very seriously in drought country. And he could distinguish water types by sound from 50 feet away on a still day. He never explained it as supernatural. He called it attentiveness. He said most people stopped listening to the world when they were about 7 years old and never started again. I inherited his property in East Texas when he passed. His name was Cornelio Vasquez, and he'd lived on that land for 60 years and had opinions about every acre of it. My mother, his daughter, had moved to Houston decades earlier and wanted nothing to do with the inheritance except to make sure I took it. I was 28. I had some carpentry skills and no particular plan. I drove out in November to assess what I was looking at. What I was looking at was about 90 acres of longleaf pine restoration, a spring-fed pond, a workshop full of hand tools that must have cost a fortune new and were now worth something considerable to the right buyer, and a wood frame house that needed a new roof and new plumbing but had good bones. It also had, and this I didn't find out until my second night there, a notation in the back of my grandfather's land journal indicating that the eastern third of the property was not to be crossed on foot between sundown and sunrise, for reasons he didn't specify beyond the word active. I want to be clear about the timeline. I found that notation on my second night. I'd already spent one night there, the first night being uneventful except for the sense that the pine forest to the east of the house was acoustically different from the pine forest everywhere else. The sounds didn't carry the same way, which could have been topography or wind patterns or any number of things. On the third day, because I was cataloging the property and had not yet read the notation, I walked east. The longleaf pines out there were old, actual old-growth survivors, 2 feet across at the base, the long needles forming a canopy 60 feet up that turned the afternoon light amber and even. I walked slowly, partly to appreciate it, and partly because the ground had a spongy quality that required attention. There was a spring somewhere in that direction. I could hear water, low and constant, and I was oriented toward it when I found the tree. It was a longleaf pine like the others, except that at about shoulder height, the bark had been removed in a perfect circle all the way around the trunk. A band of exposed wood maybe 6 inches wide, the cambium beneath it long since dried and healed over, the scar pale gold against the dark bark above and below. Into the exposed wood, carved with something sharp, was a series of marks I didn't recognize. Not letters, not numbers, but shapes that suggested a vocabulary I didn't have. They repeated around the full circumference of the ring, evenly spaced, about 40 of them. There were 7 trees like this within a 100-foot radius, all marked, all at shoulder height, all with the same evenly spaced carved shapes. I stood in the middle of them and listened. The water sound was very close now, and there was something else. A secondary sound underneath it lower, with a resonance that I felt more in my chest than heard in my ears. I thought of my grandfather. Most people stopped listening. I started back toward the house. I'd been walking for maybe 10 minutes. I should have reached the house by then when I realized the trees weren't thinning. The old-growth forest was continuing. I checked my compass. I was heading west, which was correct. I kept walking. 15 more minutes. Still deep forest. I stopped and turned in a full circle. Identical trees in every direction. The amber light. The water sound, which was now behind me and to my left when it should have been behind me and growing fainter. I sat down on a root and gave myself 5 minutes to not panic. Then I heard footsteps. Deliberate footsteps moving through the needles somewhere behind me at a pace that matched my own recent walking, as though something had been following at exactly the distance required to stay out of sight, matching my pace and stopping when I stopped. When I stood up, the footsteps resumed. I walked faster. The footsteps kept pace. I walked faster still. The footsteps accelerated proportionally. I stopped abruptly, a thing you do when you think something is following you and you want to catch it off rhythm, and the footsteps stopped at exactly the same moment, with none of the stumble or shuffle you'd expect from something trying to match a sudden halt. That was the moment I stopped telling myself it was anything I had a name for. I ran. Not in a direction, I just ran, which was stupid, but the logic of the body doesn't need to be smart. I ran until the trees started thinning, until the amber darkened to ordinary dusk, until I broke out into the mowed grass behind the workshop and stood there with my hands on my knees catching my breath. No footsteps in the pines behind me, but the spring sound was in front of me now, coming from the direction of the house. When I went around the workshop, I found the spigot on the outdoor water line fully open, running a thin stream into the gravel. I hadn't opened it. The water was dark when it first ran, dark like something mineral and old had been sitting in the lines, and then it ran clear. I closed the spigot and went inside and read my grandfather's land journal cover to cover. He never explained active, but he'd made a notation 2 weeks before his death in shaky handwriting. The markers still hold. I do not know what happens when no one is here to tend them. And below that, after a space, do not let it go untended. I still live there. I tend the marked trees. I don't know exactly what that means yet, but I've started carefully, slowly learning the vocabulary my grandfather left behind. The eastern section is still off limits after dark. I've never tested that rule again. What I can tell you is that the water sounds different now than it did that first week. My grandfather was right about attentiveness. The more you listen, the more the world tells you. I'm still figuring out whether that's a comfort or a warning. Story 8. I have to go back to the beginning of the summer to explain this properly, because nothing about what happened in August makes sense without the context of how long we'd been in that valley and how ordinary it had started to feel. My research team arrived in the Absaroka Range of Wyoming in late June. 4 of us, studying long-term vegetation change in subalpine meadows, a project that had been funded for 3 field seasons and was into its second. The other members were Ingrid Havorson, who ran the project and had more miles on her boots than the rest of us combined, a soil scientist named Terrence Webb, who had the specific quietness of someone who found most social interaction inefficient but was excellent in the field, and a field technician named Sophia Reyes, who was in her first proper field season and compensated for her inexperience with a thoroughness that put the rest of us to shame. We camped in the same location we'd used the previous season, a flat area on the eastern edge of the main meadow, close enough to the creek for water but set back enough that the undergrowth didn't trap moisture under the tents. By late July, we had a routine, a rhythm, the kind of field season normalcy that makes you forget you're in true wilderness. We joked at dinner. We knew each other's habits. The meadow felt like somewhere we belonged. The first thing I noticed, and I want to be honest that I didn't flag it at the time because it didn't seem relevant, was that the marmots disappeared. Marmots were constant background noise in that meadow, their alarm calls, their movement across the rock fields at the meadow's edge, the way their activity shaped the afternoon light. Around the second week of August, they went quiet. I noted it in my personal journal as an ecological observation, then forgot about it. The second thing was the smell. Brief and episodic, never strong enough to identify fully, something organic and cold, like the bottom of a lake in spring, present in the early morning when I stepped out of my tent, and gone by the time I'd thought enough about it to mention it to anyone. I figured it was a drainage issue, a wet area I hadn't identified. I didn't look for it. The third thing was what Sophia found in Transect 7. Transect 7 ran along the eastern edge of the meadow, close to the tree line where the subalpine firs began. She was doing her standard vegetation assessment when she called me over on the radio, voice careful and controlled in the way she'd learned in the field. She showed me, without touching them, a series of marks on 3 consecutive fir trunks. The marks were not natural, not bear rubs, not elk antler scoring, not any kind of insect damage. They were deliberate, a series of parallel horizontal lines, deeply incised at a height of about 6 feet. 3 lines on each tree. The spacing between the marks was exactly consistent across all 3 trees. I measured it twice, which meant they had been made by a single action, something capable of making 3 parallel marks with absolute uniform spacing, 6 feet off the ground. Ingrid looked at them for a long time. She said, "Elk don't go that high," she said. "Bears don't space like that." Then she said we should camp closer together that night, which wasn't a suggestion in the tone she used. That was on a Tuesday. On Thursday, I woke at an hour I estimated as around 3, with the absolute clarity of someone who has not drifted awake but been pulled from sleep by a specific sound. The sound was a voice. Soft, close, no more than 20 feet from my tent, speaking in a low, even murmur I could not parse into words from where I lay. It was not Terence or Sophia or Ingrid. It was not human in the way I mean when I say I recognize a human voice, but it was close enough to human that my brain registered it as language before my eyes were fully open. I lay still and listened. The murmur continued for about 30 seconds, then it stopped. Then, and this is the part that made me want to not be in my body, it started again, but this time in a different location, 20 feet to my left approximately. Same cadence, same low even register, as though it had moved without the sound of movement, or as though there were more than one and they were communicating. Terence unzipped his tent. I heard the sound of him standing, and then his flashlight came on and swept the meadow. There was nothing in the beam. The murmuring stopped. In the morning, Ingrid made the decision to move camp to the trailhead, not to abort the season, just to sleep with our vehicles accessible. We packed methodically, nobody panicking, everyone quiet. Terence found the thing that changed the remainder of my field season, and quite a lot about how I think about remote field work. He found it in the vegetation quadrat directly adjacent to our tent cluster. A perfect circle of flattened grass, maybe 4 feet in diameter, where something had pressed the vegetation down to the soil. The grass blades not broken but bent flat and remaining flat against any effort to lift them. The soil beneath compressed and slightly warm. In the center of the circle, half buried, was a piece of bone I couldn't identify, not a bird bone, larger. The bone had been inscribed, worked deliberately with a series of marks identical to the ones Sophia had found in the transect. Horizontal parallels precisely spaced, covering the full length of the fragment. The bone was inside the perimeter of our tent cluster, between our tents. I put it in a sample bag and labeled it. Ingrid told me to leave it. I left it. We never found an explanation. The vegetation study concluded the following season without further incident, but Terence did not return for the 3rd season, and Sophia changed her graduate program to something that didn't involve fieldwork. Ingrid and I have not discussed it directly since we filed our joint field notes, which contain no mention of any of the events I've just described. I still think about the voice. More than the marks, more than the bone, more than the circle of flattened grass. The way it moved without moving. The way it had the shape of language without the content of it. Like something that had learned what communication looked like from the outside without understanding what it was for. Story 9. Nobody in our family talked about the branch of the Kessler side that had stayed in northern Minnesota. My father mentioned them once, when I was maybe 14, said they were lake people, that they'd always lived near the same stretch of water, that they kept to themselves in ways that had calcified over generations into something that could be mistaken for unfriendliness if you didn't know the history. He said it in a way that ended the conversation. My mother, who was not a Kessler, said nothing and changed the subject. When my father's cousin Hilda Kessler died and left a property on Birch Mirror Lake in the Northwoods to my father, and my father, who was too ill to travel and had no interest in the land anyway, signed it over to me, I drove up there in September of the year I turned 32. Just to look, I told myself. Just to decide what to do with it. The drive took me through the kind of country that makes you understand why some people never need to go anywhere else, and also why some people leave and never come back. Birch and aspen gone yellow and white, the sky a pale scoured blue, the lakes flashing through the trees every few miles like brief windows into another world. I stopped for gas at a small station run by a woman named Berit who, when I mentioned the Kessler property, asked how long I was planning to stay. When I said maybe a few days, she nodded and said, "The nights get long up there." She meant it literally, I decided. October, Northwoods, the usual. Hilda's house was on a small bay cut off from the main lake by a point of land. The house was old, everything painted the same faded red that the Scandinavian settlers had used for a century and a half in that region. A dock still solid, a woodshed packed tight with split birch. Inside the house, neat, cold, smelling of cedar and old wood smoke. In the living room, on every available surface, were photographs in mismatched frames, decades of family gathered around this house on this dock with this lake behind them. All of them serious, not unhappy exactly, but watchful, like people who lived with their attention oriented outward most of the time. I found her notes in a kitchen drawer held together with a rubber band. Hilda had been meticulous, grocery lists, bird counts, water temperature readings going back years. And tucked inside the bird count notebook, a separate folded page in handwriting that was slightly shaky, suggesting recent authorship. The one that comes in November is not the one that came in October. Do not look at it directly. Leave something at the dock edge if you see it in the water, not food. Something that belonged to someone it has already seen. I reread that 3 times and then I put it back in the drawer. That first night, I slept well, which surprises me in retrospect. The house was warm, the wood stove did its job, the lake made small sounds against the dock that were genuinely soothing. I woke once and lay for a while listening to a loon somewhere on the main lake, that particular call that sounds like grief made into sound, and went back to sleep. The second day I walked the property, found the boundary markers, old ones stone-piled, some bearing the same carved circle and line marks I'd noticed on some of Hilda's walking sticks inside the house, which I'd assumed was decorative. Walked the dock. The water was very clear and very dark, the color of weak tea, the bottom disappearing quickly below about 8 feet. On the dock boards near the edge, someone had left a small pile of objects, a button, a piece of folded paper, a child's shoelace. Old. Been there a long time, weathered into the wood somewhat. Left there deliberately. Leave something at the dock edge if you see it in the water. I went back inside. The third night was when I saw it. I'd gotten up around midnight for water, and on my way back through the living room I glanced out the window toward the lake, which I'd been doing periodically because the moon was strong and the water was beautiful, and I'd been thinking about the family photographs and what it meant to stay somewhere your whole life. The moonlight on the lake was nearly white, and the surface was still enough to reflect the tree line on the far shore. Something was standing in the water about 15 feet from the dock. It was tall, taller than the dock railing when it stood upright, and it was standing in what should have been deep water, which meant either it was standing on something, which was impossible given the topography I'd observed, or it was very, very tall. It was facing the house. Its surface was pale, but not a uniform pale. Something about the skin, or what I was interpreting as skin, had variation to it, texture like bark or waterlogged wood. It was not moving. The water around it was not disturbed. I remembered Hilda's note, "Do not look at it directly." I looked away. I stood to the side of the window, close enough to be aware of its presence through my peripheral vision, far enough that I wasn't looking at it, and I waited. The moonlight moved slightly as a cloud passed. My peripheral awareness of the figure remained constant. It didn't move. After what I estimate was 20 minutes, it was gone. No sound of departure. Just gone, the water as still as before. I went to the kitchen. I opened the drawer with Hilda's notes. I took out a photograph of myself that I carried in my wallet, the only one I had, a photo from my college graduation that I'd been meaning to move out of my wallet for years and never had. I went to the dock. I placed the photograph under the button and the piece of folded paper and the child's shoelace, something that belonged to someone it has already seen. I don't know if it had seen me through the window before I looked away. I don't know what the photograph was supposed to accomplish. I don't know enough about the logic of what lived in that lake to know whether I did the right thing or just made myself easier to find. I sold the property in the spring. The night before the sale closed, I called my father and told him what had happened. There was a long silence. Then he said, "Hilda survived 60 years up there." And then he said, "You weren't supposed to go in October. That was always the rule." He wouldn't say which rule. He wouldn't say whose rule. He's never mentioned the Kessler property again. The photograph is still on the dock, I assume, unless it's been taken into the water. I don't think about that. Story 10. The last thing I'll tell you is the one I've told the least, because it's the most recent, and because the most recent things are the hardest to wrap in the past tense where they're safe. I was driving back from a job in the hill country of central Texas, fence work, a week's worth, for a rancher whose name I don't feel the need to include, and my transmission started acting up about an hour outside of any town of consequence. This was October 2 years ago. I'm a mechanic by trade, and I know enough to know that the particular shudder I was feeling meant I needed to stop before I didn't have the option to stop gracefully. I pulled off the state highway onto a county road that looked like it went somewhere, which it did eventually, to a small community, but not before passing through about 12 miles of cedar and limestone country that was as empty as anything I'd seen in the state. I limped to a turnout near a low-water crossing and stopped, called roadside assistance, and got an estimated wait of 3 hours, which I chose to believe was accurate. I was parked on a small rise above a dry creek bed, looking out over cedar-choked limestone escarpment rolling away in every direction, getting toward evening. The temperature was dropping with the sun. I got out and walked the dry creek bed for a while, because sitting in a broken truck for 3 hours seemed worse than walking around under an open sky. The creek bed was white caliche with scattered cedar duff and deer tracks and the occasional cactus clinging to the exposed limestone. Quiet, the kind of quiet you only hear when you've left the highway far enough behind that even the occasional truck sound doesn't carry anymore. I found the dog around a bend in the creek bed. Not a dog. I want to be precise. Something I understood as a dog in the first half second, and then revised when I had more than half a second to look at it. It was roughly dog-sized and roughly dog-shaped, and it was sitting in the creek bed facing away from me. Its posture was wrong, too upright, sitting on its haunches in a way that placed its back at a nearly vertical angle. Its fur, if it was fur, was the gray-brown of cedar bark. Its ears were too large and set too high. I stopped walking. It didn't react. I stood there for maybe a full minute, not moving, not understanding what I was looking at, cycling through the list of things it could be. Coyote, some kind of large fox, a stray dog with mange that had altered its appearance. I was building each explanation like a wall, and each explanation held for about 5 seconds before something in the image dismantled it. It turned its head slowly to look back at me over its shoulder. The face was wrong. The face was so wrong that my mind did not file it under any category. It simply registered wrongness, error, something outside the taxonomy. The eyes were set in the wrong place, the muzzle too short and too flat, and there was something about the quality of attention in the gaze that was not an animal's attention. It was the kind of attention that knows what you're thinking about doing before you do it. It looked at me for maybe 3 seconds. Then it looked forward again, stood up, and the way it stood up was wrong in the same way the face was wrong, the geometry of it off in ways I couldn't specify, and walked away down the creek bed at a pace that was deliberately unhurried, each movement exact and careful, until it went around the next bend and was gone. I walked back to my truck. I sat in it. I locked the doors, which seemed both necessary and futile. I watched the tree line until the tow truck came, 2 hours and 40 minutes later, which was the longest 2 hours and 40 minutes of my life, not because anything else happened, but because of the specific quality of watching a tree line when you know that something is watching you back. You can feel a tension like that. My grandfather taught me water, wind, the world noticing you. This was the same, except it was a gaze and not a sound. When the tow truck driver got out, he looked at me in the cab and asked if I was all right. I said I was fine. I said the transmission had died and I'd been stuck for hours. He nodded and went around to hook up the truck. On the front bumper, when I went around to check his work, were 3 parallel scratch marks, deep, fresh, going through the paint to the metal. They ran horizontally across the full width of the bumper, spaced with that same exact uniformity I'd seen in the Absaroka research, evenly spaced, the depth consistent across the full length. Something with 3 closely set claws, or something that made the equivalent of 3 closely set marks, had dragged across my front bumper from left to right. The scratch marks don't match any animal I've brought them to. My mechanic looked at them. A wildlife biologist looked at them. Neither offered a category. I still have that truck. The scratches are still there. I've thought about painting over them, and every time I'm about to start, I think about that gaze, the quality of attention in it, and I leave them alone. I don't know why. Maybe it's a way of staying honest. Maybe it's a way of saying this happened, this is real. Whatever made those marks exists somewhere in the Cedar Hills of Central Texas, and it knows what you look like before you've decided what to do, and it leaves its evidence on purpose. The creek bed was dry. There were no prints. There was no sign that anything had been sitting in that white caliche when I went back to look. There was only a shallow impression in the dust where it had been sitting. A smooth, compressed oval, larger than any dog's haunches. The caliche packed down as if something heavy had rested there for a long time before I arrived. Thank you so much for spending time with these stories tonight. If one of them stayed with you, that particular image, that sound, that thing you now can't fully push out of your mind, let me know in the comments which one it was. These accounts come from real places, real stretches of American land where the ordinary rules seem thinner than they should be, and the people who came back to tell about them are grateful simply to have come back at all. Hit that like button, subscribe so you don't miss the next collection, and share this with someone who needs a sleepless night. Until then, take care of yourselves out there, and maybe don't investigate the sounds too closely.